I would like to welcome everyone to the forum tonight. My name is Betsy Sykes, and I am chair of the Undergraduate Fellows Committee. The Fellows Committee here at Harvard is truly a unique opportunity. Students get a chance to interact meaningfully and substantively for a panel of experts that we have sitting behind us for a semester-long period of time. And while the fellows are here, they run weekly discussion sessions called study groups on their topic of expertise that all members of all students at all students here at Harvard and the surrounding community are welcome to attend. We have information right inside the Institute of Politics about all of our fellows and their study groups, and I encourage each of you to take an opportunity over the course of this semester to get to know each one of the fellows I have sitting behind me. They're an amazing group of people, and we're really excited to have them here tonight. Here to introduce the fellows is Secretary Dan Glickman, the new director of the Institute of Politics. He is a former congressman from Kansas and more recently the former Secretary of Agriculture under President Clinton. So,
okay, well, thank you very much, Betsy. Appreciate it. All right. Well, thanks. Tonight we have an opportunity to chat informally with six, I think, very, very great people who will be here all semester and are available, I think, to everybody in this school as well as throughout Harvard and anybody else in the community who want to just sit down and talk with them about their experiences and what they've done. And all of them have accepted one challenge, which is public service in one way or the other. And I think that's what we kind of want to talk a little bit about tonight. But I'm going to introduce everybody. We're going to start with my left, and that's Teresa. I'm sure you're accused of that a lot, right? Yeah. Teresa Mato. Teresa is president of Citizens Works, a Washington, D.C.-based Ralph Nader-founded nonprofit which advances justice by strengthening public participation in democracy. In the year 2000, she served as national campaign manager for Ralph Nader's presidential campaign. In fact, David Broder in the Washington Post called this the best campaign of them all. So she graduated from Harvard in 1986 and received her law degree from New York University School of Law in 1989. Next to Teresa is Stuart Butler. Stuart is Vice President for Domestic and Economic Policy at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. He plans and oversees the Foundation's research and publications on all domestic issues, but his specialty is in health, welfare, and Social Security. In 1999, he was cited by the National Journal as one of the dozen key players in the national debate over how to deal with the uninsured. Stuart is an export of England, but he has emigrated to the United States after receiving a myriad of educational degrees there and here, and became an American citizen in 1995. Next to Stuart is Jeffrey Davidow, who has just left his position as U.S. Ambassador to Mexico, a position he held since July of 1998, or over 4 years. Prior to that, he served as ambassador to Zambia, ambassador to Venezuela, and was the Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs from 1996 to 1998. He received his BA from the University of Massachusetts, his master's from the University of Minnesota, and he studied also at a university in India. Next to our ambassador is Gil Garcetti, who served as District Attorney for Los Angeles, California, the leader of the country's largest non-federal prosecutorial agency, and he was there for 10 years. He was DA during a number of high-profile cases, including the Los Angeles Police Department Rampart corruption case, the Menendez brothers, Michael Jackson, as well as a little-known case about O.J. Simpson, but I'm not supposed to talk about that. But I can at least mention it, all right? I mean, you can't hide. You gotta, you gotta. Okay.
Not here.
Anyway, he's also an author. He's completed writing and photographing his documentary photo book entitled Iron: Building the Walt Disney Concert Hall, which he may want to talk about. The son of Mexican immigrants, he was born and raised in South Central L.A., graduated from the University of Southern California, the London School of Economics, and received his law degree from UCLA. Next to Gil is Gillian Sorenson. She is on sabbatical from the United Nations, where she serves as Assistant Secretary General for External Relations. She's responsible for outreach to civil society, including accredited non-governmental organizations around the world. She served 4 years as Special Advisor for Public Policy to Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali, where her duties included directing the United Nations over worldwide 50th anniversary ceremonies in 1995. She has also served as President and CEO of the National Conference of Christians and Jews, of which I was a board member back in Kansas, by the way, and that is the country's oldest human relations organization dedicated to fighting bias, bigotry, and racism. And she is a graduate of Smith College. And next to Gillian is Gillian's husband, Ted Sorensen, who served for 11 years as a policy advisor, legal counsel, and speechwriter to Senator and then President John F. Kennedy. Deeply involved with such matters as the Cuban Missile Crisis, civil rights legislation, and the decision to go to the moon. This is a man of great history, and unfortunately, or fortunately for him, he doesn't look like he's lived that long. You know, he's got more hair than I do, certainly. But his eloquence on paper, as combined with the president's wit, charm, and intelligence, motivated a generation into public service for many, many years. His words helped President Kennedy face down the Soviets, brought our country together when it was being torn apart by segregation, and inspired us to reach for the stars. He practices international law in New York. He has written many books on the presidency, on politics and foreign policy. He was born in that other fine Midwestern state, Nebraska. Any event, and for those of you, I'm from Kansas, that's why I say that. Any event, we're delighted to have all of these folks here, and what I'm going to do is start, I'm going to ask each one a question, to which I would ask them to be, as responsive as possible, but perhaps talk about some of the issues that were instrumental in forming this great institution. So I'd start with Teresa. And Teresa, in the 2000 presidential election, you made a conscious choice to lead a fight many thought could not be won. And yet you committed yourself to that fight. What compelled you to dedicate yourself to such an insurmountable challenge?
Aha. Well, let me see. Let's start historically, because historically in the United States, third parties have made a difference in what we stand for as a country today. If you take a look at the abolitionists, the suffragettes, the farmer populists, the trade movement union, and throughout U.S. history, those positions have become slowly but surely adopted. So Ralph Nader took a look at the political landscape in 2000 and said, hey, we have a situation where people are not talking about poverty. Front page of the New York Times today, poverty is increasing. In my city, Washington, D.C., 1 in 3 children lives in poverty. We have a situation where 43 million Americans don't have health insurance, and far more are underinsured. We have a situation where we have discrimination in the civil justice system. Are people talking about it and doing something about it sufficiently? We have a situation where we have public campaigns that are not publicly financed, and a system that is indentured to a lot of money. We have a situation where we have global trade agreements that have ability that are formed in secret and that can trump national sovereignty, our laws in this country, and we're not talking about having citizen-managed trade agreements. And so all those reasons and the desire to build a third party, we threw our hat into the race, and I stood behind that decision and helped execute it.
And let me just ask you one question related to that. Of course, at the end of the race, some people, well, a lot of people certainly thought it was great that this race was run. Certainly people in the Democratic Party have said not so kind things about your campaign because they believe that you may have had an impact in turning the race to the incumbent president. How do you respond to that? Is that how do you think the young people should respond to that?
Well, it's not the duty of a third party to make sure that one of the two major parties wins, just as it isn't the duty of, say, a startup.com to make sure that Microsoft beats Intel in the marketplace. To say that a third party has to make sure that one of the two parties secures a certain number of votes is really not the American way. Second, nobody's entitled to your vote. Every candidate has to go out there and earn your vote. And if you don't earn the majority of votes, then you don't win. But I would argue that actually Mr. Gore did earn the majority of votes, and that maybe we should take a look at a system that renders the kind of results that we got. Finally, I would say to young people, it's very important to stand up for your principles. Leadership is about standing up for your principles, even when it's not convenient, and even when your friends are going to take issue with you on some of those principles. I've been very fortunate that I can take my conscience to work every day, and I can still do it after the 2000 campaign.
Very good. Stuart, perhaps the biggest issue in this country long-term is the issue of affordable health care. The title of your study group is Health Care in America, Can We Reach Consensus? Do you think it's ever possible to be able to reach consensus on health care?
I really do think it is, and there are a couple of reasons for this. One is if you actually look at the sort of debate among experts on healthcare in terms of the technicalities of it, you're seeing a remarkable drifting towards consensus in that area. I take part in lots of discussions in Washington of people in different think tanks and in agencies and so on. And what I've been impressed with over the last few years is how that debate has become much more civil, and also that the areas of agreement have become more and more numerous. So I think from a technical point of view, it can be done. Politically, I think it can also be done, although that's obviously harder. The reason I think it can be done there is that, again, I think there are a number of people in both parties that recognize that, healthcare can easily be a simple sort of political stick to hit the other guys with, and we've seen that over and over again. But on the other hand, the size of the problem, as you've mentioned, is so enormous. And also, it's not just today, but as you look in the future, it becomes even more enormous when we start talking about how do people like ourselves expect to have health care available when we reach old age. That there really has to be a responsible effort to try to pull things together to see if there's a common way. And I think that's beginning to happen. And so I think as we discuss this in the study group, I hope that those in the study group will come to the conclusion that we can remove the question mark really at the end and say, you really can do this. And now it's an issue of leadership as to whether people will come forward and see that there's a political benefit from actually trying to achieve a result on this issue.
I think this is going to be a fascinating study group that you're going to lead here, and maybe we can produce the result here that will get the Republicans and Democrats together on. Ambassador Davido, you have been an ambassador in 3, I sound like a Miss America contest, we're going down here, but you've been...
I'm in favor of world peace.
You have been ambassador in 3 countries. You've been ambassador in Mexico, and Venezuela, and in Zambia. And, one of the things that it strikes me is that in the last decade or 2 or 3, the interest of the American people in what's happening in the rest of the world seems to have diminished for a variety of reasons. And you've served around the world, and you've got to believe that it makes a difference that the United States be engaged and its people be engaged in the international arena. Would you care to comment on these issues and how to get people to believe that it matters that we are an involved country and that citizens are involved as well in the rest of the world?
I think it's quite... First, I agree with you. I think people are less interested. I think Americans are generally more self-involved. I think the way to convince people is to make them understand that what happens in foreign countries and how we conduct our relations with those foreign countries can really have an impact on their daily lives. I can make that argument for any country I've served in, including Zambia, but nowhere more importantly than in Mexico. And when you think about it, there is the impact of Mexico, Mexican developments, our policy with Mexico, has a greater impact, greater importance on the life of average Americans, on the life of people here, than I think almost any other country in the world. That's not to say that Mexico at any given point in time is necessarily more important than Afghanistan or Israel or Japan. But when you think about it, look at the things that are of concern to us and your relatives. Maybe not so much here in Harvard, but to the people back home. Whole question of the changing nature and the changing demographics of American society. We now have the largest immigrant population in our nation's history. Close to 12% of our population, over 30 million people, are foreign born. And that presents a demographic reality that we have to deal with in this country through migration policy and other issues. The whole question of law and order, things Gil Garcetti worked on, narcotics, fugitives who use the border one way or the other to escape punishment. Teresa was talking about trade deals made in secret. Well, I don't know how you can have a vote in Congress and call it secret, but nevertheless, this is important. What has NAFTA done in terms of the United States, Mexico, and Canada? Is NAFTA a model to be followed for the rest of our relations, of trade relations with the world, or is it something to be avoided? The point I'm trying to make is, and this is to answer your question, Dan, how do you get people involved? You get people involved by continually trying to inform them that what happens in foreign countries does have an impact on how they live, the language they speak in the schoolyard, who their neighbors are, what wages are, what we produce in this country and what we can no longer produce. In some parts of the country, the air we breathe, the water we drink, all have a Mexican tie, and all are related to issues of public policy, laws, regulations, norms, that the people who attend this university and who teach at this university will have a great involvement in making in the coming years. So, thanks for the question.
Well, your study group, is it going to focus on U.S.-Mexican relations?
The study group is perhaps more narrow than any of the others because it is going to focus on U.S.-Mexico relations. I am absolutely convinced, that sounds very pompous, I am absolutely convinced. I think anybody who's looked at this can say that the relationship between the United States and Mexico today is profoundly different from what it was 20 years ago. 20 years from now, it will be much different than what it is today. Are we heading towards some kind of European Union model in North America? Is that possible? Is it desirable? The issue, though, for me is those decisions are largely going to be made by the people who are students today. And so I want to focus on that and draw the links between public policy, making laws, changing laws, maintaining laws, and the future as it relates to this specific issue of Mexico.
Thank you. Teresa, what was your study group? What's the name of your study group?
It's called, after consultation with the liaisons, it's called Taking on the System and Mobilizing for Justice. And we're going to look at the ways to use nonprofit advocacy, Congress, lawyers, popular culture, and direct action to influence decision-making at the local, state, national, and international levels.
Great.
Now, why do I think that a study group with the title Taking on the System and Mobilizing for Justice is probably going to get more interest than U.S.-Mexico relations?
Well, you'll...
Thanks.
Maybe they'll take on your study group. Gil Garcetti,
Yes, sir.
you are probably, in many respects, at least in modern history, the most media-oriented person here in terms of your more recent experience when you were a district attorney. And, you know, your experience challenged the ability of public officials to face the world with this extraordinary media scrutiny, and some would call it frenzy. And here you were working in the criminal justice system with some high-profile criminal trials, and you probably couldn't walk out into the outside world without having to filter through this type of scrutiny. So I'm just curious, is it possible to conduct good public policy in, let's say, the criminal justice area or any areas in this era of a frenzied environment that we live in?
That's a huge question, Dan. It's a question that we're going to address in our study group, frankly, is the role of the media. We're going to be discussing not just what the district attorney's office is. We're going to be discussing some substantive issues, death penalty, three-strike law, interaction of an elected official with a chief of police or commissioner and with other elected officials. But all of that drowns when all of a sudden you have what the media portrays as a high-profile case. Now how do you do your job? And how do you interact with them? Understanding that in a community as vast as Los Angeles that has an electorate as large as Massachusetts. I mean, Los Angeles County is larger than 43 states in the nation, population. So you don't go knocking door to door when you're running for office. It's that media that you have to rely on, and if the media doesn't like something that your office is doing or you're doing, how do you deal with that? So we will be we'll be discussing all of this in our study group. It's a challenge, I think, that we all need to just kind of grab a hold of as citizens, but certainly for the study group participants who are thinking, do I want to be a leader? Do I want to be in public service? Do I want to be in political service? And there's a difference between the two. You have to deal with the reality of the media and how do you interact with them.
Great. Gillian, you have this extraordinary background, incredible background, particularly your service in the United Nations. I think you're the first person that's ever been a fellow here that's in recent years, certainly.
Right, 15 years ago.
15 years ago. You've worked closely with Kofi Annan, and you see what the United Nations is going through right now as we're dealing with the situation in Iraq, where it's really where the proverbial rubber hits the road in terms of the international focus on Iraq. And I just thought you might want to talk a little bit about the leadership qualities of the UN generally, and specifically Kofi Annan as he and they address the concerns of the U.S. and the UN in the Iraq area, and maybe elsewhere, but Iraq particularly.
Well, to say a word first about Kofi Annan, one interesting thing to remember about him is that he didn't seek the job of Secretary General. In a sense, it came to him. If you recall the history, Boutros Ghali was seeking a second term and did not achieve that. And for a variety of political reasons, mainly domestic American issues. And so they cast about to find a successor, an African, and it came to Kofi Annan, who was the first Secretary General ever chosen from within the organization. As it happened, he was the right man at the right moment in the right place. And the qualities that he brought to it, the extensive knowledge of the organization from A to Z, the knowledge of the strengths and weaknesses and limits and possibilities, all of that came with him from day one. The United States, among others, supported him, and indeed last year when time for a second term came along, he achieved something that had never happened before, unanimous reappointment by 189 member states, which is to say everybody, even those who may have disagreed with him, supported his re-election. That gave him an additional strength or latitude to do what he felt he had to do. As a man, he's unafraid. He always has been. He has an inner strength, an inner confidence, a core that you almost see it right here, that just in a moral compass that just directs him in the way that he has to go. So when this recent issue, this difference of view with the U.S. came along, I was already here during this last week, but I wasn't a bit surprised that he might take issue. He has before, but usually it's not in the headlines because he works discreetly. He's often behind the scenes. But normally he has a very strong, very open and communicative relationship with the U.S., as with most other countries. It's an exceptional personality for an unusual time. The ability to draw people together, to find consensus and so on is quite remarkable. And although he and the U.S. differ at this moment, I have not one doubt that they are essentially moving in the same direction, differing about the means to get there, but that they will be in accord as we go further.
Very good. And what your study group, what are you going to focus on?
Well, I'd like to make the UN come alive. It's not an abstraction, it's not something out there, it's something that really does change lives and save lives. And although what you read about UN is always peacekeeping, that's only 20% of what we do. There's another whole scope of activity, including development and human rights and health issues, and of course the US-UN relationship and other matters. We're going to have, I think, a lively and interesting discussion about the UN in the 21st century, why it matters, where it makes a difference, how it saves lives, changes lives, promotes democracy, and I think that is going to be a lively session.
In my previous job, I had a lot of experience with the World Food Program,
yes,
which is a UN agency that's probably saved hundreds of thousands of people from starvation.
Absolutely. Yeah. One of the best.
Ted Sorensen, yesterday all of us were over at the Kennedy Library, and we read several of John Kennedy's speeches, and then we saw them in the interactive media operations that they have, and we felt your vision and your penmanship in much of that. And I know that you're going to be a great resource here for people who want to know more about those years. But I just thought you might give a little bit of thought about your observations about the public attitudes towards leadership and public service since the Kennedy years.
Well, excuse a long sentence. As the judge said to O.J. It's not surprising that after almost 40 years of failed presidencies in this country, starting with Lyndon Johnson, who was a master legislative and political tactician, but who by 1968 had failed to bring the bitter, bloody, futile war in Vietnam to a close, had failed to stop the rioting in our inner cities and on our college campuses, and then failed to gain the renomination even of his own party for another term as president. Followed by Richard Nixon, a veteran, a strategic thinker, both in domestic politics and international affairs, but he failed to cover up high crimes and misdemeanors that were grouped under the rubric of Watergate, and thereby failed to save his own presidency, from which he was ousted in 1973-74. Followed by Gerald Ford, a genial Washington veteran, earnest, well-intended, but failed to solve the crisis of confidence in the country that followed Watergate, and failed to stop inflation from ravaging our economy. Succeeded by Jimmy Carter, certainly one of the more honorable and decent men who have served in the presidency, but so inept in the ways of governing in Washington that he failed to control inflation or bring back the American hostages in Iran, and therefore failed to get a second term in 1980. Followed by Ronald Reagan, who combined the skills of politics and Hollywood in a very politically successful way. Succeeded in moving the political spectrum for the entire country and both parties to the right, but failed as the end of his second term approached to either explain or conceal the arming of desperate figures in Iran, and in fact failed even to remember that he had done it. Followed by George I. Bush. Bush, again, a decent man who knew a lot about foreign policy and was, I think, showed some leadership skills in that area, but failed to gain united support in his own party, much less the opposition, or to prevent still another recession from savaging the American economy. Followed by Bill Clinton, who I think is one of the most talented men to hold the presidency during this entire 40-year period. But began with the failure of his comprehensive health care plan because there was no consensus then to talk about the Stewart's subject, but who also showed a certain lack of discipline and judgment that brought him to be the first elected president ever to be impeached by the House of Representatives, and who will probably go down in history simply as the president between the Bushes. In more ways than one, some might say. And the current president, as Teresa already pointed out, did not win a popular vote majority. It took office under something of a legal cloud because of the convoluted or manipulative way in which the electoral vote majority was delivered to him, and he too has failed to prevent an increase in poverty, as this morning's newspaper pointed out, failed to prevent the country from sliding again into recession, and failed to keep us out of war, which he now seems hell-bent on starting. So it is not surprising, and that's the end of my long sentence, it is not surprising, Dan, that after 40 years of disappointment and disillusionment, most American people, and particularly young people, have forgotten that not so long ago we had a president who people young and old trusted and had some confidence in and were inspired by, who actually had the support of countries around the world, who was not termed indifferent to the poverties and hardships of those in the third world, who inspired not merely Americans, but people in countless other countries that I have encountered over the last 30 years to go into government or public service, who showed that the United States could fulfill the dream of the founding fathers, that this country could be a beacon to the rest of the world, who showed that there could be hope for the fulfillment of all of the standards we hope for in our politics and government, standards of dedication and devotion and honesty and competence. In those days, unlike today, young people were pouring out of our universities and law schools and other educations of learning to enter public service, to join the government in Washington. Teachers who wanted to be in the Peace Corps, scientists who wanted to be in the first exploration of space, lawyers who wanted to participate in the Department of Justice's battle for human rights. We've got to bring that era back.
Thank you. Very profound. I think what we'll do is we'll open it up now. And I'd encourage you to ask questions either individually or questions to be answered by all of the folks. We have microphones here, one here, and there's one up there and over here. I'd ask that you try to keep your questions as short as possible, and if you'd state your name and where you are in school and that kind of thing. So I see right up there. We'll start in the balcony.
Sure. It's on. Okay.
Yes.
My name's Fred Clark. I'm Australian. I'm not a student here. I work for non-profit in Newton, which is just across the river. My question is for Therese. Is it Therese? Mm-hmm. I come from a country where third and fourth parties and independents regularly do deals with the big two, and they wield great power, even though they win less than 5% of the vote in many cases. What strikes me about the American system is that that third or the fourth party or the occasional independent, Jim Jeffers aside, he seems to wield a lot of power, but the third and fourth parties don't do the deals that are done in most other democratic systems. Often the rationale is that you deal with the lesser of two evils if you're the third or the fourth party. And my question to you is, why was a deal not done with the lesser of two evils, to swing that 5% where it needed to be swung, if your premise is that there is a lesser of two evils? Did the Democratic Party candidates approach you for that 5% or vice versa? And what was the rationale for those kinds of discussions?
I've recently been to Australia, and you have a great Green senator there, Bob Brown. There were many people who approached the campaign, but not really to do a deal. The deal was drop out. And if you're trying to advance a platform or build a third party, as in this case, where during the campaign we created 450 new green locals, and we're helping an embryonic party that, as you know, has office holders in 70 different countries. It was not about doing a deal, especially when we were not viewing the political landscape as there was evil and lesser evil. We were viewing the landscape as there are these problems, they need to have a voice to them, they are not going to be raised in the bipartisan Commission on Presidential Debates, televised presidential debates, and that there needed to be people standing, willing to talk about those problems, to raise those problems, and a party that needed to be built to help move the agenda. And so it was never a question about doing a deal. It was always, you were told, drop out. And that really is not acceptable if you are standing and you're entering the race not to ensure, the premise of dropping out is, of doing a deal is to make sure that one party or another wins. And that was not the motivating premise behind this campaign. It was about increasing popular sovereignty over corporate sovereignty and saying that Washington, as it was not getting the job done.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Ethan Anderson. I'm a second year at HBS across the river. My question is actually for Mr. Garcetti. In high school, I think it was 1993, I shadowed you during Career Day. It was a wonderful experience.
Thank you.
And at the time, they had just passed the three strikes law in California. And I know that you had some moral qualms about the three strikes law because I think the very first case to be prosecuted for the third strike was a check fraud case in which the person convicted was going to go to jail for life for check fraud. And I guess my question to you is, one, given the drop in crime that resulted in California and in the rest of the country with tougher sentencing, has your opinion changed at all? And two, what is your feeling about implementing laws which you didn't necessarily create nor necessarily agree with?
I remember you shadowing me. It was a good experience. This is something we're going to discuss in the study group, and it goes back to leadership. He's making the point that while there was a campaign for the three-strike law, I came out opposed to the three-strike law that was in fact enacted. I was in favor of a three-strike law that limited the third strike to approximately 25 designated violent or serious felonies, and you can name them all, the murder, rape, armed robbery, things like that. But the electorate overwhelmingly passed a much broader law that said anyone of over 450 crimes now make it eligible for you to suffer the penalties of a third strike. And it was a lesson in leadership for me because even though I had pushed one thing and there was editorials in favor of my position, the electorate had voted otherwise, And so I implemented, within some discretion, that policy. Didn't feel particularly good about it. Nevertheless, we saw, for many reasons, not just because of the three-strike law, crime, in fact, did. On reflection, I look at that now and say, I missed that opportunity of leadership. The opportunity of leadership was that I could have been fired through the electoral process if I had simply said, I do not believe this is the appropriate law. I will use my prosecutorial discretion, because a prosecutor does have the discretion to refuse to charge a crime even if you can prove that a certain person committed the crime, the evidence is there. You can simply say, I'm not going to charge the crime. And I could have done that. And again, on reflection now, I probably should have, rather than simply bowing to the electorate that had overwhelmingly passed it. But again, in our study group, we're going to talk about successes as well as failures of leadership, the lessons that we learn through this. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Yes.
Yes, how are you? Omar Abdul Malik. I'm a research fellow here at the Kennedy School. And my question is for Ted Sorensen, but anyone else on the panel can chime in if you'd like. And it has to do with the status of race relations in the United States. And the reason I asked you is because you have vast experience dating from the 50s on. And I would just like for you to comment on what you see as the progress or lack thereof in that particular area.
And let me put it this way. It's a very good question. If John Kennedy were to come back to the United States today, after having been in 1963 the first president of the United States to declare that discrimination and segregation on the basis of race and color should be banned, outlawed forever, and then provided real leadership and comprehensive legislation to achieve that end, I think he would be disappointed that there would be as much segregation and discrimination as still exists, especially in housing and education. But he would be heartened by the enormous increase since 1963 in black mayors and black members of Congress from the South as well as the rest of the country, in black lawyers and doctors and middle class and businessmen and business leaders. So that we still have a long way to go, but we've come a long way. Thank you.
Yeah. I have a question for the whole panel. You all have had long, extensive careers in politics and have devoted your lives to political service or public service. What would you say to many of my contemporaries who feel that politics has nothing to do with their lives and think that it's even a waste of time to go out and vote?
Teresa, we'll start with you. We'll go down.
Politics has everything to do with your daily life. And when I say politics, I don't necessarily mean running for senator or running for president or holding any elected office. Politics is very personal, from the air you breathe, to the water you drink, to whether your food is inspected properly or not, to whether you have a workplace that's safe that you can go to and not expect to have all kinds of occupational hazards and injuries, to how much traffic you have to battle on the way to work, whether highways get built or whether we have crumbling infrastructure, crumbling public schools, and spend more than 50%, as we do now, of our federal discretionary federal revenues on the military. Politics affects you from the minute you wake up to the minute you go to sleep every single day. And if you don't get involved in politics, or as Ralph Nader likes to say, if you don't turn on to politics, politics will turn on you. And so in every opportunity you get, it's not about running for office necessarily, but it's about paying attention and having a voice in your community, how things are governed in your state, in your country, and around the world.
Well, I obviously agree with that. Politics is an instrument to bring about changes in our daily lives that affects us in profound ways, whether we like it or not. And it's understandable, I think, these days why so many young people are turned off by the way the political process actually occurs. I mean, we do have a dearth, I think, as Ted alluded to with presidents. It's also true in members of Congress, a dearth of people you can really respect as leaders. And I don't just mean you respect somebody who happens to agree with the particular position you have. I have great respect for many people on the left of the spectrum that I don't agree with in terms of the policies they propose, but they are people who stand up for principle and engage in a real debate over fundamental issues. And I think that it is important to get involved in politics and also to seek out people who are running for office that you feel really do espouse some fundamental principles, and support them and show them that, and show these people that if they espouse principles, if they stand on principles, then in fact there is support for them. Because I think increasingly people feel that, you know, the way to get to office is to hire somebody who writes good negative ads against your opponent. And if that's all that works, then there's an enormous pressure to do that, even if deep down you don't want to do it. But if younger people show, as they did with Ralph Nader, that they will gravitate towards a politician who really stands for something else, I think that will be good for the entire political system. And that will lead not only to an increase in younger people feeling that they can invest some capital, an emotional capital and time in the system, but it will also lead to better policies for the country.
Yeah.
This is not an entirely new problem. Americans have always been skeptical about politicians. They've been the butt of humor. Will Rogers said he never voted because voting only encouraged the politicians. I mean, it's, you know, something to keep in mind. I think part of the problem in recent years, though, is that politics has become trivialized. It's just another part of the great celebrity sweepstakes. And there's not a whole lot of difference between Britney Spears and the candidate for senator in Ohio, in the way they're marketed, in the way they're perceived. And just like there are people who don't want to pay attention to Britney Spears, there are a lot of people who say, well, I'm not going to pay attention to this guy who's running for Senate. I think one of the antidotes to that is to encourage people to not focus on politics and politicians as much as the press and the game compels us to, but to focus on government and on the issues of government. And, you know, your friends who aren't interested right now will become desperately interested and probably very much more active, when the issue is not, you know, which pretty boy is going to get to be senator, but who's going to be on the school board, and how much taxes are going to be dedicated to building libraries. And that's really the stuff of government. And I'm not really as depressed or despondent about the fact that so many people seem to tune out, because quite frankly, a lot of politics in the United States ought to be tuned out the way it's presented.
Yeah.
I reaffirm, obviously, and affirm everything that's been said. Let me bring it home to you a little bit. As the district attorney, I had to go to what we call our Board of Supervisors. Where you live, it might be called the same, or Board of Commissioners. You know, they have the money. And I was asking for more money to hire more lawyers to do the things I wanted them to do. And I remember a member of Congress, Yvonne Burke, who was a member of the 5-person Board of Supervisors, asking me, and said, Gil, where do you want this to come from? Should we close a library? Should we close a hospital? Or should we close a park? Because we only have a certain amount of money. Where do you want it to come from? Those are tough decisions. She set me back. Well, I don't want you to shut any of that. Well, I can't manufacture money. And I think what the ambassador just said, when most of you are at the age where you're having families, then it really begins to hit home in terms, well, are they going to have enough books for my son or daughter? You know, what kind of teachers are they going to have there? Where's that money going to come from? Well, it depends who you elect, yes, but it also depends on who's running your government. That so-called bureaucrat, that has such a negative name to it, unfortunately. Do you have quality people there who are thinking ahead? Or are they simply reacting to what the paper says is the latest crisis?
Gillian?
Well, I especially endorse what Teresa said very eloquently. Perhaps it's because I'm at the UN every day, and I know people there who would literally die for the privilege of voting. It is inconceivable that they wouldn't vote if they had the opportunity. And they long to have the chance we have and scarcely take notice of having two active opposition parties. So to treat it casually, to say, oh, I'm too busy to bother with that, to me is just hard to believe. I remember to this day the frisson, the shiver of excitement and pride and sense of responsibility and adulthood that I felt when I cast my first vote. And that actually comes back to me when I vote each year. So to me, it's not a burden, it's an opportunity. And you should seize that opportunity because it really does have the potential to change the world we live in. Now, it would help if the politicians we elect were really people of intellect, honor, integrity, and vision. That's not always the case. They're human beings, after all, with their flaws and shortcomings. But it's our responsibility to vote for or run to be the best politician or politicians we can possibly have.
Very good. Ted?
Betsy, with due respect to you and and the importance of your question, I don't know why we're wasting our time debating this issue. Nobody in this room has a choice. This is a democracy. The people in this room are the cream of the crop. This society has been very good to you, or you wouldn't be here. How about paying something back to that society? How about helping shape it, make it a better society? Because for all the reasons my colleagues have said here very clearly, of course you are affected by those political choices. And you have an obligation to get involved, to care about outcomes, to do your bit, not just voting, but helping in campaigns and helping in government itself. Because that's the only way we're going to have a society that continues to get better. That's the only way you're going to repay a little bit of what's been done for you and meet your obligations as a citizen. There's a new book out. I didn't tear it out of Widener Library, but I tore a page out of the book. It's about one of Franklin Roosevelt's key White House assistants back in the days when White House staff was fairly new. A wonderful man named Ben Cohen. And it's the biography of Ben Cohen. And in that book, I came across, if I can find it, a quotation from the concluding paragraph of Franklin Roosevelt's final speech in the 1936 presidential campaign when he's running for re-election. And he said, and Cohen, I think, probably wrote this paragraph, sometimes men and women wonder overmuch what they will receive for what they are giving in the service of a democracy. Whether it is worth the cost to share in that struggle, which is a part of the business of representative government. But the reward of that effort is to feel that they have been a part of great things, that they have helped to build, that they have helped to share in the great battles of their generation. I can testify to that. Get involved.
As the moderator, I would just add one other point. Having been to college at the University of Michigan in the 1960s, it dawned on me that most major changes in our country come from college students and young people. I mean, that's the dominant place where intellectual thought then pushes the government. And you're all in a very interesting period of time now. I mean, just take what's going on right now. We have the potential of entering into a major war that could cost the lives of people in this room, maybe. I'm not arguing whether it's good or bad. I'm saying, and politics is going to decide that issue. Politicians, presidents, Congress. And one would think that that would be, if not an inspiring reason to get involved, for a selfish reason, it would be kind of interesting to know that you might have some role in that decision. And college campuses historically have been the place that have led the way to then politicians in making decisions later on. Yes. Wait, I'll tell you what. Back here. Okay. Sorry.
Hi, my name is Stephen Yanes, and I'm a first-year MPP at the Kennedy School. My question is for Mr. Sorensen. I see John F. Kennedy as a person who defined and challenged a new generation of leadership, and his generation as a whole. If he was alive today, post-September 11th, sitting here in front of the Kennedy School, in front of us, what do you think he would say to us? What is defining our generation? Where are we going? What would he say?
Well, frankly, I think he'd be disappointed that this generation seems to have less interest in public service and shaping a better society than did his generation and the young people I talked about in the 1960s who did come into government at every level, not just in Washington, at state, local, and federal level, and for nonprofit organizations, foundations, and the like. And he would say the challenge of terrorism is really the same old challenge. It's the challenge that those who represent a very different, darker kind of world, which doesn't really believe in the values that we've been talking about today, the values of diversity, the values of a moral uplift, the values of a democratic, free, and open society. That's a challenge that those who have our values have had to beat back over the years. JFK talked about that in his inaugural address. He said only a few generations of the history of mankind have been privileged to stand at the ramparts and resist that kind of challenge. And he said, I welcome it. Well, you're a generation that's going to have to stand at the ramparts and resist that kind of challenge by building a better United States. So that's the defining challenge of your generation.
Gentleman up there.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Gareth Saunders. I'm a former city councilor from Boston. My question is to the panelists or whomever would like to answer it. Since its inception, how has the World Trade Organization affected and influenced U.S. foreign policy?
Anybody care to, I'm looking at Teresa because I'm sure she has a perspective on this.
Well, this could take a few hours, so to spare everybody, let me just point out one website that I think is fantastic if you want to learn more about the World Trade Organization and the tribunals in Geneva that decide the outcomes of contested cases among countries. And that is www.citizen.org. And on there you will find an organization called Global Trade Watch. And this is organizations under Public Citizen. Global Trade Watch has published a book called Whose Trade Organization? And it discusses what role there is for citizens and for countries within the WTO, and how policies that are being made have trumped international policies under this trade agreement, have trumped national sovereignty and various laws, and how those decisions have been done without the press, without the public seeing the cases argued in tribunals in Geneva.
I wonder if either Jeff or Stuart have a contrary perspective that they'd like to quickly share?
I haven't read the entire website, so I can't comment. But it does seem to me that there is an irony of sorts in that I think what the World Trade Organization is trying to do is provide discipline and international law to international commerce, which is going to take place one way or another. And the irony that I find, and I'm not accusing Teresa of this, is that many who are the strongest today in arguing against the perceived policy of unilateralism vis-a-vis the issue of Iraq are also the strongest in arguing against the multilateral disciplines of the World Trade Organization, because the results of some of those hearings and panel discussions, decisions aren't to their liking. Maybe that's a gratuitous comment, but I think the fact of the matter is that I don't see a way of going back from very high levels of international trade and commerce, by the way, which benefits most of us as consumers by increasing competition. Economic dislocations come from increased international trade. We should not be unaware of them. And to try to find a way to control that trade, to bring countries in, to demand that they act in certain ways that are responsible, I think is essentially a good idea. Whether it's working out that way is debatable.
Let's take these last two questions right here real quickly. Yes, sir.
My name is George Bresnik. I'm a public health physician. My question is to Stuart Butler. I'm a Kennedy grad from '93, and during that time period, healthcare reform was at the top of the agenda. We spent a lot of time talking about the technical aspects of health reform, and it all seemed very doable, and then overnight, the whole process was derailed by the big drug companies and the hospital associations, et cetera. And the question is, when these large, powerful organizations have perceived that they have so much to lose financially by healthcare reform, how do you build consensus? Do things just have to get so bad that people agree if something has to be done, or is there a more positive route to get to healthcare reform?
Well, I'm not sure I necessarily agree with your analysis of the cause of the collapse. One can suggest all kinds of reasons, which were then exacerbated by some of the things that you did mention. The notion that, for example, you get a major reform, a 1/7 of the entire economy, by what was, I wouldn't say a secret plan, but certainly a process that led to a proposal that was then attempted to be basically rammed through the political system. That certainly, in my view, was not the most effective way of getting any agreement on healthcare, and I think it fell apart largely for that reason. I think the other things were symptoms of it falling apart for that reason. I think today, though, that maybe enough time has passed that it is possible for people to begin to pick up the pieces and to be able to debate and discuss the issue in a very different way than was true in the early 90s. I think, quite frankly, one of Bill Clinton's failures was to take what had been a slowly emerging consensus and cause it to fall apart by making it a very partisan issue. I think that was a major mistake and I think an abrogation of principle and leadership. I think we can learn from that, and that's why I think it's extremely important for the attempt to try to deal with this problem to take the course of people of different perspectives, really talking together and seeing where they can move forward, rather than somebody, whoever they may be, saying, I've got the answer, and now we're going to drive this through the system. Because that will not work, it cannot work, it's almost certainly to be wrong anyway. And I think we've learned that mistake, and one of the things we're going to be trying to do in the study group is to, as I say, to see what the ingredients might be, both politically as well as technically, of how one can do what Clinton tried to do, but do it right this time.
Thank you. Last question right here, this gentleman.
My name is Ed Brown. I'm a graduate student at the Extension School. I'd ask you if you'd please speak to the leadership skills on a particular issue, a recent issue, that of the two presidents, Bush II and President Summers of the university, on the fact that one of them paints us, those of us who are against the policies, the current policies of the United States, but otherwise may be good citizens, were painted as unpatriotic or anti-Semitic.
Does anybody want to tackle that non-controversial question?
Sure, I like controversy. I think it's unfortunate that I think it's, let me say that. It's necessary in a democratic society that you are able to have discourse and dissent. And absent those two ingredients, you don't have a democratic society or a democratic republic or anything that purports to be a democracy as we would promote. And to always paint your opponent as anti-Semitic or unpatriotic or un-American or whatever terminology is used because they hold a different viewpoint is just doesn't advance the debate and is generally unhealthy. You don't want to have a society where people self-censor. We didn't fight in this country to establish the values that this country at least purports to stand for in order to be told that we're not allowed to talk, your neighbor might be spying on you, watch what you say. If you do dissent from any particular policy, therefore certain labels will be painted on your forehead and you're a pariah. But that's not what this country is about, and we shouldn't promote that.
Okay. I think that we will end this. We're going to go upstairs. Everybody is invited to the penthouse, which is on the top floor here, for a reception. I believe there is food. Is that correct? Is it good food tonight? Oh, good food tonight. Okay. And we appreciate your coming. Let's give the panelists and the fellows a hand.